Okay, hi. So thanks everyone and welcome to this Cardamom seminar series. So very happy to have Greg Toner talk today. And I'm going to ask my colleague Doris to introduce Greg.
Well, hi everyone. So cuireann fáilte roimh ar fad an seo anocht, agus cuireann fáilte chrí rih Greg Toner, Olaf le Gaeilge in Ollscoil na Ban Riana in Mill Firste. So I welcome you all here tonight and extend a special welcome to our guest speaker, Greg Toner, Professor of Irish at Queen's University, Belfast. I'm personally very delighted actually to be able to introduce Greg Toner, as he was my external examiner for my PhD in the mythical pre-pandemic time of Trinity College. So Professor Toner's research interests cover many fields, including medieval Irish language and literature, lexicography, onomatics, and interactive language teaching and learning. Many of you will know Greg Toner as the director of the Electronic Dictionary of the Irish Language, or EDIL, the EDIL project, which is now a central resource in medieval Irish studies. His talk today is about a more recent project funded by a Leverhulme grant focusing on automatic dating of medieval Irish texts. And I extend my gratitude again to Greg for agreeing to give a talk in our Cardamom seminar series, Cardamom Magat. And yeah, Leonard Ike, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Doris. Now let me just try and share my screen here. Yeah, so hopefully you can all see that. That's okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, I'll offer some apologies. I apologize to all the computational experts in the audience because I am no programmer. I have been very dependent on my colleague Xu Han in terms of the programming for this, and there are aspects of this that he could explain much better than I could. I also apologize to anybody coming from a purely linguistic background, because I'm trying to make this a bit more technical, looking at the technical side of what we did in this project. So I hope I can serve that audience in any case. So for many of you, you will be aware that the dating of medieval Irish texts is a very fraught problem. In the first instance, almost no texts have externally validated date of writing or publication. And so we have very few securely dated texts from which we can date other texts to which we could anchor them. Even texts for which a date of writing is known through internal evidence are usually not preserved in contemporary manuscripts, leaving open the possibility and indeed the certainty that the choice and forms of words and grammar have changed during subsequent centuries of transmission. In the majority of texts, several hundred years can intervene between the date of composition and the date of the manuscript in which they are preserved. Related to the problem of transmission is the fact that a great many narrative texts and even verse texts are composite. In some cases, this can be quite mechanical, with redactors combining two versions of a tale in quite obvious ways, or inserting clearly later sections. But more often than not, the process of expansion and redaction is much subtler, involving excisions, insertions, and redrafting. And if we were reliant on these texts for dating linguistic and lexical changes, we are in very insecure foundations. So it's within this context that Xu and myself at the Lexicon project set about trying to harness machine learning to provide a complementary technique for the dating of Irish texts. We opted from the start to employ unsupervised methods rather than to manually construct a model of language change in advance. Given the paucity of securely dated texts, linguistic changes themselves can often not be dated precisely. So any manually constructed model could have errors built in from the start. With unsupervised learning, the algorithm that we developed can learn how to identify diagnostic features itself, without any preconceived instructions as to what is significant. In order to train the algorithm, we use various sets of annals. These have the obvious advantage over other texts in that they provide a precise annual date covering the entire period in which we are interested. However, one of the problems is that they're not necessarily contemporary and in many cases are demonstrably not so. So to begin with, we concentrated on the contemporary annals, contemporary entries in the annals of Intoxication for the period 1092 to 1309. The entries for this period are contemporary in every sense. They were transcribed by those who composed them and are not copied from an earlier period, but reflect events of the very recent past, usually of that year. As such, they must reflect the language of the scribes. However, in order to expand the dating horizons beyond 1092 to 1309, we had to introduce additional material from the Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Loch Kay. As Intoxication was the most accurate, we used this as the core and used Ulster and Loch Kay for the expansion. Our final expanded corpus for medieval Irish thus includes just over 13,000 sentences covering the period 729 to 1588. We found that it's not possible to go back any further than 729 without rapidly deteriorating results. We did some pre-processing on the annals texts. So we used, of course, the extremely useful Celtic corpus for all of our texts, but particularly for the annals. And we're extremely grateful to Celtic for permission to do so. The annal years are labelled in Celt, which is extremely valuable in building the training corpus. We stripped out any Latin from the text. I saw Padraig Moore in the audience. I apologize, Padraig, for stripping out the Latin. But the problem with that would be, it would work extremely well for the training, for working on the annals. But then if we tried to apply that to other kinds of text beyond that, it simply would run about looking for examples of texts which contain Latin and probably date them earlier than they should be. So having removed the Latin, we then removed any Roman numerals from it, partly because of the fear that they might encode the date in some way. The date is frequently written in the text in Roman numerals. And finally, we then removed any annals of less than 5 words after all these other processes had been carried out, as these would have been too short to provide meaningful training data. The most popular method of dating texts when we began our work was classification. This treats dating as a multi-class problem, with classes defined as time periods such as days, months, or years. This has generally proved superior to regression or ranking approaches, and so was the one that we adopted. However, classification of itself poses several problems that we need to address. The first of these is the use of regular time intervals of equal length, which is contrary to the knowledge that language change may be irregular. Secondly, where the boundaries fall is determined by an arbitrary starting point. Wherever you start in your collection determines the starting point and the subsequent divisions then as well. And finally, time intervals as class labels are assumed to be temporarily independent of each other, so nothing of the temporal order among timestamps can be captured. We worked around these problems with several techniques, including greedy grouping, flexible time intervals, temporal landmark selection. All methods achieved similar levels of accuracy, and in the end, we used FTI, the flexible time intervals one, as it was simply the most efficient. I was usually running about trying to get the most accurate method of dating, and she was most concerned with finding the most efficient way of getting there. Rather than accept predetermined time intervals for the training, as had previously been the case, flexible time intervals, or FTI, adapts the intervals to the nature of the material. As classifiers tend to assign text into the class with most similar text to it, a classifier might assign a borderline text to the wrong class, as in number 6, where we're trying to locate this X prime text. If it's sitting right here, it might assign it to this category. Whereas if we use different time intervals, it can assign it to a different category depending on where the border actually lies. So what our FTE algorithm attempts to do is to tune the time interval according to the training data, thereby implicitly exploiting the temporal distribution of the training corpus. So values for delta, this time interval, we initially set at 3, 6, 10, and 25 years. But following tuning of the entire corpus, delta prime was then set at 3, 5, 9, and 11 years. The optimum value of the temporal parameters was established by sorting the average dating accuracies. Feature selection is an important aspect of the problem. Features may include lexical items, stylistic features, or topics, but n-grams have proven to be the most successful. Given the irregularity of Irish spelling, it was not surprising that word n-grams had little effect on the success of classification, so we adhered solely to using character n-grams where n equals 1, 2, and 3. And this is the broad scheme that we arrived at. So you can see there that we're taking as our input the pre-processed text from Intoxication, from the Annals of Ulster, and from the Annals of Lough Kay, between them covering a whole period. Initially, we started at 500, but we're not really expecting anything at 5. We know from the Annals of Ulster that they're frequently not contemporary from that period, and even when they are contemporary, they tend to be in Latin. So that's our input. That's what we start with, and then our output is this corpus, which consists of 8,500 plus typical texts from each of those annals. And to do that, we go through these various steps. So for a specific number of given values, and we're using this dating tolerance delta that I've already mentioned, we learn n dating models based firstly on Intoxication. We will then repeat this and keep expanding the corpus as we go. So this is essentially tuning the temporal parameters, tuning delta here to something more sensitive to natural divisions within the language of the annals. We then date the texts of Intoxication, the entries or chunks of the Intoxication text, using the trained dating models with the tuned temporal parameters, and produce from that what's called a further training corpus, an FTC, and we're selecting out the correctly dated ones, the ones that are predicted to have the date corresponding to the date given in the annals. Then for the same n giving values of dating tolerance delta, we then again learn n dating models on the training corpus of FTC plus Ulster. So we're expanding as we go, and we keep repeating that until we've got down to the bottom where we've included Lough Kay, and that produces our final dating model in that case. Now, looking at the performance of this, can look quite impressive. So you can see there just the circled figure at the bottom. I mean, realistically, we're not hoping to date something within 3 years. Although you can see there on Intoxication alone, you can do it with a 40% accuracy if that's what we require. But really looking at what we would expect to know about linguistic dating, a period of 25 years, plus or minus 25 years, i.e. a 50-year period overall, is much more realistic. And we see here we get an accuracy rate of just over 75%. In other words, in 3 out of 4 cases, we will actually predict the date of an annal to within plus or minus 25 years. Now, that all sounds very encouraging. What's less encouraging is when you start to look at the performance across the entire range, and that's indicated by this graph. Now, some of this might be too small for you to read, but basically down this end, we're looking at the years 500 to 549. These are all 50-year period, that plus or minus 25 year gap. So you can see there that the accuracy rate there up until the period 700 to 749, the accuracy rate is completely negligible. So it's not really working at all at that stage. And even when we get to 740 to 749, the accuracy is quite limited. Between 750 and 1000 then, in between those two red lines, the accuracy rates are a bit uneven. Where are we now? Yeah, so we can see down here at 950 to 999, we're not getting just over 20% accuracy rate. So a lot of variation there. Once we get past that, we can see now that the accuracy rate is never falling below just over 65%. So for the whole period from 1000 onwards, we're getting an accuracy rate in excess of 65%, usually above 70, and indeed in the final 3 half decades there, we're getting an accuracy rate of over 80%. So it becomes highly predictive at that period. Now, this is due in no small part to, I suppose, the period at which the annals are beginning to become contemporary, but it's also related to the number of annals that we have available for training. So if we overlay this with this is now the number of annals that are available for training. We can see here up until 1000, we have very small numbers of annals in the Irish language of over 5 words, etc., that are actually we can use. And this has some impact then on the ability of the algorithm to learn. Once we get past that, you can see that the number rises. And certainly by the time we get to the end of the period, we're dealing with many more annals, and hence the accuracy rates are probably increasing at that stage. Now, the ultimate aim of this is not to date the annals because, well, they've already been dated. There's a little question in there about some of the very early ones. It would have been nice to be able to look at the early ones and say which ones are contemporary, but in actual fact, you can see from before about 700, there's negligible levels of accuracy anyway, so it can't really be used for that. But the ultimate aim of the project was to apply this model to other texts which have not been dated, longer text, poems, narrative text, tales, etc. So the idea was to use the model that we've constructed on the annals and apply that to these longer texts. So we're using the same model that's been generated in the first phase of the work. And then in the subsequent material, again, we're adapting the material. So as we saw in the training corpus, the shortest text that we used were 5 words long. And there's an overall average length of 23.6 words. So in order to make the model closer to the saga texts and the prose texts that we'd be using, we cut those longer texts up into chunks of about 20+ words, trying to adhere to natural divisions, sentence divisions, etc. But very long sentences then we divided further using whatever punctuation marks were available to us. This is all done automatically, it's not done by hand. So essentially what we're doing then is we're dealing with these individual chunks of data within these longer narrative texts. While our initial training set of time intervals were 3, 6, 10, and 25 years, we thought it much more in alignment with conventional linguistic dating patterns to work at actually slightly longer dates. So we're talking about here about delta set at 50 years, plus or minus 50 years, which gives you a 100-year period at which you're looking then. We've seen that the FTI model is about 75% accurate on annals at plus or minus 25 years, and that rises to 85% accuracy at plus or minus 50 years. So there's a greater possibility that we will be accurate when we're working at those timescales. As we're dating individual chunks here, not the whole text initially, our method produces multiple dates for a single text, which we can then plot on a graph, such as this one here for the life of St Brigid. You can see there, this text is, the life of St Brigid is conventionally dated to the first half of the 9th century. And this is clearly echoed in our dating here. I think that's 912, that long bar there running across. So conventional dating saying first half of the 9th century. We're a little bit later than that, about 900 AD. So we'll come to look at that in a moment as well. We also, as with all these texts, we get this long tail, which could be read as errors, but it's also possible, and it seems certain in some cases, that this is due to transmission interference, where actually we have a text coming from a much later manuscript. So any kind of modernization along the way is going to get picked up as well. So actually picking out these different layers is one of the issues that we have to face with this method. Another text, the Intoxication of the Ultraman, can be processed in a similar way. So here we have two different texts. So the second of these is the B version, is here from dated to just after 1200 AD. Now, this is slightly too late, but it's in the right kind of ballpark, sorry, for that. Watson would place it in the first quarter or the first third of the 12th century. So maybe up to 100 years too late for that. That's an issue that I'm going to come back to. The earlier version, we can see this long stage of about 900 AD. We can see another little level here at about 1100 AD and another one about 1200 AD. So the production of later dates here might have multiple causes. For example, we have thought that if particular styles or linguistic features persist over a long time, they can get associated with the later period as well as the earlier period. So they can't really be disentangled. And also the more plentiful record that we have for the post-1200 period in the annals might also account for some favoritism towards a later date. Could also be an issue of genre, because we're taking our model from the annals, these short annalistic texts, and applied that here to prose. We have a solution or a partial solution to this, to which I'll return shortly. A further problem specific to the 12th century, which I will return to shortly as well, is that there's a gap in the training material. The Annals of Ulster, Loch Kay, and Intoxication all have a gap in the middle of the 12th century around the same time. And I think that's having some effect as well. I just think the sun's coming in directly through the window here. I'm going to close the blind here. Okay, hopefully that's a bit better.
Yeah, it's a bit easier to see you there, Greg. Thanks.
This is what happens when you leave your home environment and you go to work in your office again. You're not used to where the sun's setting. Okay. These graphs can be quite complicated to read and so forth. So we then turn to a method of simplifying the presentation of results. And we had to do this in order to quantify the success of the method in some way. So what we started to do was produce tables showing the 3 top dates, so you can see here in Meshka Olive, the A version, we have 1 date there, another date here, second most common, and a third here, the third most common date. So as I say, the aim of this was to test the method, to have some quantifiable way of testing the success of the method when applied to other texts. We selected a broad range of texts in order to be tested. And we started with those texts which had the most certain dates, those which had been dated most closely and with most certainty by linguistic scholars. We also tried to cover the whole period from Old Irish up to early modern Irish. We knew there would be problems with the Old Irish because the annals, the model that we built with the annals wasn't really working before 729. So we didn't really expect a large degree of success with that. So here are some of the results for that, split into 3 slides. I'm going to look at Middle, Old, and Early Modern Irish. This current one shows the results for Middle Irish. So you can see the conventional dates in this column, the second column here, for these texts. And then these are the 3 dates that are produced by our algorithm. If they're highlighted in yellow, then they overlap with the conventional dating to some extent. So we can see quite a large degree of success within this. All but one of these texts have at least 1 correct date. And in fact, many of the dates are very closely bunched together, showing a high degree of success is being achieved. The other interesting thing that emerges from this is of the texts that were closely dated for Middle Irish, many of them were coming from contemporary manuscripts. They were coming from the Book of the Dun Cow, or they were coming from the Book of Leinster. So there was very little late interference like we see in 15th, 16th, 17th century manuscripts. We're not getting signal from there. So this kind of bunching is due to the fact, well, they actually are hitting a ceiling here because of the date of the manuscript itself. The dating of the third text here, the expulsion of the Jesha, we can see it just didn't work. We got that wrong. There's probably a reason for this. This is the later recension, but it's actually very short. We were quite desperate to get texts that have been closely dated in some way. And this is just 22 lines long. It's from the Book of the Dun Cow, this version. It's in the hand of H, which is the later hand within the Book of the Dun Cow. So the chronology is not a long way off the dating of H. The dating of H has been dated to the 13th century, more recently to the 12th century, second half of the 12th century. So let's say the date of 1208 is not much later than that. But anyway, we're dealing with a very short text there, which may explain why we're not getting a proper response for that. The next one down, the death of Gaul, we can see here, it sticks out a little bit because it has this unreasonably early date of 914 stuck in there. And there is a slight quirk in the method. Once you abstract the three dates, we can look at the graph for this here, and we can see in this case that's the very early date. It's a very small portion of chunks, so that's about 12 chunks out of 120, so about 10% of the text has been dated to that period. Whereas we can see actually there's a much broader graph here dating the text between 1100 and 1200 AD, so much closer to what we would really expect. Sorry. Yeah, just to go back, can I go back? Yeah. So one of the things, I mentioned this problem already in terms of the 12th century. If you look closely at this table of results, you'll see that we are getting any text that belongs to the 12th century has been dated either to 1124, sorry, or 1187. There's a big gap in the middle. And we think that that is due to the fact that there's a big gap in the annals at this period as well. So this failure in the 12th century, we think, is related to imperfect data for the 12th century within the models. There is a way around that that we will hope to implement in the future, and that is to use another set of annals, which does cover the period, the annals of Tigernach. And once that's done, we would hope not only to get a good spread of dates within the 12th century, but also end up with more accurate results for then as well. So, the dating of the Old Irish texts, as I've already pointed out, we're dealing there with really quite imperfect training data from which to build a model. And this becomes very evident then when we actually attempt to date things. If we look at, so I've marked 1000 there as the date. This slide shows the dating success or otherwise for the Old Irish texts. So these, again, the conventional dating is given down in this column, the second column here, for these texts. You can see more or less, we can't really push the date back before 914. So Old Irish is generally held to cease at around 900 AD. So we're finding it very difficult to see back into Old Irish in this case. We do get one date for Sultan Aran, which is the only major verse text that was included within the corpus. So that's coming up there. But otherwise, beyond that, we're not really very successful. The one thing that we would say about this is it does seem to be successful in it's using this 914 date. When you see this 914 date coming up, you can start to think, well, this is an Old Irish text. It can't see beyond 914, but that's as close as it's going to get to identifying an Old Irish text. Looking at the early modern texts, this is where we thought we would do really well, because the model that we trained on the annals, as I said, at times we got to over 80% accuracy. When we look across the board here, it's quite a different question. We're not really reaping the benefits of that large training set. So the again, these are the conventional dates in the second column. So we get very nice dates for the colloquy of the ancients, Agil and the Shanarach, 1208 and 1229, bang on the conventional dating. The Battle of Moylena, dated by Jackson, not entirely clearly how he gets there, but dated to him in the second half of the 13th century. We're getting early modern dates for those. But then after that, you can see it's more or less random. The one interesting thing is all the dates are falling in the early modern period. It knows that the early modern texts, but it just cannot date them with significant accuracy within that. We saw in the Middle Irish period, it was very good at discriminating, but here it's not doing very well at all. And on reflection, the reason for that is probably quite clear, and that is human scholars find it extremely difficult to date on linguistic grounds the distinction between a text from the 13th century and a text from the 15th century. So the computer is really only replicating the difficulties that a human scholar would have. And interestingly, a human scholar could probably look at these texts to you and say, yes, it's early modern Irish, but just as the algorithm does. Beyond that, it's much more difficult to do. Interestingly, it is suggesting that the annals are evolving in some way, the annal texts, because you can't get that rate of success amongst the annals without it detecting some kind of patterns. But exactly what that might be is another issue. I suspect it might be something to do, it might just be reading names at that case. We're setting it to look at character n-grams, but it could actually build up patterns associated with particular names, the names of kings, etc. Within that, I could be using that to date the annals, but then that's completely untransferable to other texts beyond that. Okay, so that's the basic model, how the basic model works. So then we looked at how to address some of the problems that were arising from it. How do we move? So the first question, how do we move from the annals to narrative texts? We're assuming there's some kind of problem going to be involved within that. So one thing that we looked at was bias compensation. So we knew that our training data, the annal texts, were unevenly distributed in time, and they're very specific to that genre. They are annals, they're not prose narrative texts, for example. So to improve on that, then we use reinforcement and adaptive machine learning, also known as domain adaptation. So this is designed to use a source data distribution to produce a well-formed pattern for a different but related target data distribution. Essentially for our corpus of longer texts, we wanted the algorithm to try and detect biased dates within it. Now, a spoiler alert here, it didn't really work very well, but just getting this out of the way. So you can see the results here. We do get an improvement for the 9th century text. So this is our baseline results for the Cattle of Freya, the Dream of Angus, and so forth. You can see we're getting an early date of 914. That's the results I've already showed you. Once we run the bias compensation, we're actually starting to get some earlier dates. We can push that back a bit. So that is kind of helpful. However, once we start to look at the Middle Irish texts, it just starts to mess things around an awful lot. Bias compensation, essentially, it's stripping away some of the best signals, and then allowing weaker signals to show through. And once we apply that to ones that had already been dated quite well, the performance doesn't get markedly worse, but it does in some cases, and it really isn't a very helpful process within that. And for early modern Irish, you can see it actually gets worse again. I mean, it's still largely dating things there to the early modern Irish period, but we're getting fewer accurate hits, if you like. Not that it was great before, but it's actually getting worse. So this kind of bias compensation that we attempted wasn't really working for these texts. So the next thing that we tried to do was something that was called focused dating. So up until now, what we've been working with are deltas set at plus or minus 50 years. Okay, so that's the margin of error that we've allowed ourselves within that. That's a 100-year period. The idea of focusing is Well, in our training model, we can date things at 3 years. It'll not be as accurate, but it's a more precise period. I make that distinction between precision and accuracy. So accurate means it's correct. Precise means it's narrowly focused. So the idea of this essentially is that we take the longer period, and then we say to the algorithm, okay, you can now date this to a shorter window, and we're using here a shorter window of plus or minus 10 years in that case. So we're trying to find really plus or minus 10 years, i.e. a 20-year period within that 100-year period to date the text to. So the important thing to remember there is it's not starting all over again. It's restricted to that 100-year period. If we started from the beginning, let's say, with plus or minus 10 years, we have this very narrow window, and it could be all over the place because it doesn't have sufficient data to produce a robust response. Now it's got a 100-year period, and it's only allowed to work within that 100-year period, and then it runs off to try and find a more precise period within that. So there's the results on this slide. And this actually has taken in more texts at this period. So after initial exploration, we then started to look at texts which had not been dated as securely by scholars as the initial tranche of text that we looked at. And what we see here is there are various improvements to the dating of texts. Now, it must be understood, it's only looking within that 100-year period. If the 100-year period is wrong to start with, well, being more precise within that is not going to get it any better. It's still going to be wrong because it's the wrong 100-year period. It's looking the wrong 100-year period. So, but just in terms of the ones that were correct to deal with, what we can start to see is that some of the dates are becoming more accurate and starting to bunch together a little bit more. So I think we mentioned earlier the expulsion of the Jesha here, which had been dated too late. It's not getting any better because it's in the wrong 100-year period. The life of Adhanan here, again, has been dated too late, and it's not going to get any better with this method. Incidentally, the life of Adhanan, I mean, there is an argument to say that it should be dated later than the conventional dating, but we'll not get into that just here. It's quite possible that the algorithm picked up the correct date here at 1120. So what we see then are clear improvements, such as consistent 10th century date for Sultan Iran, so the second text here. So it's now moved the second of the date back to 922. I mean, this date of 950 to 988 is probably over simplistic because this is a composite text too. But anyway, we have two 10th century dates now for this text. It seems to settle that particular text in that period. Every text with just two exceptions already mentioned has at least one and more frequently two acceptable dates. These are all shown in a kind of gray-blue color. I've left the yellow behind, but everything that's kind of, I hope you can see that. All of these dates here are acceptable. They all fall within the margin of error for this. And I will say just a quick word then about the date of manuscripts and transmission. I think I've already mentioned this in passing, but we have found that the latest dates offered by this method often correspond to the date of the earliest manuscripts. So I mentioned the 12th century manuscripts, which we can see here in the second box. You can see the latest dates. Well, there's a rogue 14th century date, but really 1280, 1230 is the latest that we're getting. And considering one of the scribes is at least second half of the 12th century, this is very close to the date at which he was operating. But otherwise, a close grouping of texts of these texts, look, all the dates are closely bunched together, reflecting both the date of composition, which has been determined on usually on linguistic grounds, and the date of the manuscript in most cases. Only rarely does the date go above 1200, as I've already seen. Of the other ones, once we look at the life of Ultraman, for example, we have this 1120 date, which might well be valid, as well as these other dates, very late. But of course, the manuscript that it's been taken from is 17th century. It's actually from the 17th century manuscript. And we think that what it's picking up here is the orthography. If there are elements of the orthography that are very distinctly late, it's picking up on those, and those can creep in during transmission. If we look at down at the bottom, Agaluna Shenarach here, early 13th century text, it's dated now to 1197. Once we focus in, both dates go to 1197. There's a very strong indication there that it's picking that up as its date of composition. And a very late date here, 1516. But of course, that is found in a 15th century manuscript, the Book of Lismore. The last one there, the Battle of Moylena. Again, it's given two quite accurate looking dates compared to Jackson's dating here. But also this 1527 date. And of course, that appears in a 16th century manuscript. So we seem in this third column to be quite often picking up the date of the manuscript in which it has been transcribed. And that's part of the difficulty of dealing with the interpretation of the material. What reflects transmission and what reflects the original date of composition. So just to conclude then, we do have this lack of training data for the Old Irish period, which completely limits the power of the algorithm. We'll never get that to work. It is possible, just in terms of the domain adaptation that we looked at, what we call bias compensation. It does improve it, but we think what it's doing there is stripping out the Middle Irish signals and allowing the Old Irish to come through. So it's possible that you could improve things slightly, but it's only slightly by working with that. The fact is the model's not strong enough for that period. The domain adaptation has little effect on later periods. So it's quite possible that domain is not genre is not a problem here. We could improve the model further, even as it's currently constituted, by improving the training data. I've already mentioned that peculiar gap in the annals in the middle of the 12th century, which we know how we could fill from another set of annals. We could also use some other texts, leave the annals behind and move to use other texts from the Old Irish period. They don't have that kind of specificity of a year that we would get from the annals, and there could be some argument about the date of some of the material, but we could find short text from, for example, the Old Irish glosses that would at least give us a more robust way of dating Old Irish texts. So there are possible improvements to be made to model there. And I think focusing has actually proved, as well as just, I suppose, providing a more narrowed, focused date for each of them, actually starts to pull things together a little bit more as well, and starts to show particular decades showing up as the likely period of composition. So it produces not only more precise results, but also more accurate results. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the classifier. Thank you very much for listening, and I think we will take any questions now. If I can stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'm sure there's lots of questions, so thank you. Yeah, so applause. Okay, so does anyone want to start off with a question? Lots of applause. I don't know if it's hands up.
I
All
will.
right.
Adrian, yes, sir.
Well, dús gur míle agus a socht chur láthair fíor hamúl agus anna min sunra comma bhí sé aus ar fad. Thanks very much. I could ask a number of questions. I've been taking plenty of notes throughout, but I think the thing that jumped out most to me was the fact that, at least in terms of the accuracy for dating Middle Irish texts to the Middle Irish period and early modern to the early modern Irish period, you had quite a high success rate. You mentioned that you used n-grams because word level grams weren't perhaps they weren't as accurate for you. I don't know if you gave any figures for that, but it strikes me that there must be something very interesting happening in terms of dating texts that perhaps doesn't transfer to other NLP tasks. In terms of the data that you used, n-grams, I've found that you can't, even character level n-grams, you can't use it to accurately do things like automatic tokenization, for example. So there must be something related to the dating of texts that transcends that boundary into the digital text, and that's another factor transcends the editorial practice, because of course you said all of your texts were from the corpus of electronic texts, which will have been edited first in generally print editions and then edited again when put online. Do you have any idea what the factor might be that is being picked up on, other than just you mentioned names, but there has to be more than that to get that accuracy, I would think.
Yeah, my suspicion is, and one of the problems with this is interpretability. How do we interpret the results? Because it's not very transparent exactly what it's doing. I've actually sat and I've poured through the n-grams that it's producing and the relevance, statistical relevance of each of them, and it's very difficult to see too many patterns of emerging. But one suspects is what one of the things that's happening is because it is about n-grams. At one level, it's very easy, for example, to look at a text and see whether it's got an E or an EA. Now, an E in a text can represent different things, but the absence of EA, it's going to give you an early modern date for a text. And similarly with lots of other digraphs like, a GH or BH. Now, remember, this is based on the annals. It's trained on the annals, and that's maybe the interesting thing. So a lot of the earlier annals can have later orthography. So it's still able to detect that they are false in the annals. But when applied to other texts, it's actually able to use that as a distinguishing feature. Now, that's one thing that could be occurring. I said for the early modern texts that I suspected. I'll tell you, we actually ran it in English, and it was able to get reasonable. I forget now the exact success rates, but it might have been about 50% success rate on the English version of the annals. Now, the only thing, it's not picking up any linguistic variation there. It has to be topical in some way. So the most likely thing is it was just picking up on names, but it's doing that from groups of 3 characters. So it must build up a pattern of names for those. The fundamental question here is with the irregularity of our spelling, the grammar, etc. Word n-grams, well, we threw them into the mix at the start. They made virtually no difference to the results, and that's why we just scrapped them, because it's just wasting computing power trying to look at them. I reckon to a large extent it is sort of building up unseen patterns of n-grams that reflect in some way either orthography, In some cases, perhaps linguistic change as well is being detected within that.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I jump in with another one, or did I see Doris wanted to jump in?
I think Park is next, but if it's quick, sure, or
Okay, I'll just make it quick there, because you mentioned that you think the orthography has a big influence on it, but of course a lot of orthography wouldn't come through the editorial process, I think. So I assume and correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about particular spelling combinations when you mention the orthography.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, it can be quite difficult to sit down and work it all out across the whole range of material. But if you take a basic distinction between middle and early modern, then it's that kind of the rise of EA, which starts to appear in the 12th century in text. We find it in some Book of Leinster texts, but also the writing of say GH and BH, that kind of thing. So various different things like that might well be coming into play. Can't be all to do with that. I mean, if that was all that was happening, then you would just distinguish between middle and early modern. But there may well be patterns, differences in the way people are employing the orthography that changes subtly over time, and that we don't really notice, but it's in there in the annals. But there may be other linguistic information encoded within that that we can't pick out. We don't know exactly what is used, and that's part of the problem. We don't know what is used.
In which case, it might be very interesting to test this on similar texts that have been edited to a different standard. For example, I know there's a version of Ashling Ongasa on Thesaurus Linguae Hibernicae that's edited to a very different, probably more diplomatic standard.
Yeah, no, that would be interesting. The only thing is with that particular text is we know that we couldn't date it accurately. It's an Old Irish text, so we wouldn't succeed in that. We have used this on English language texts because we did a lot of our training on English language because we know that we have very precise dates. So newspaper archives, for example, were used. So you're actually down there to talking about dating it to days and months, that kind of thing. And it works for that. It can actually pick out the changes within those kind of corporate as well.
Okay, well, thanks very, very much again.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian.
Okay, thanks, Park.
Thank you very much, Greg. I really appreciated your presentation. I had two, if possible, quick questions. The first was to ask you to comment about the relationship between dating language and dating texts. So maybe you answered this, but if I, for example, write an email, the ordinary words, everyday words I use in my email will possibly be unchanged in form since like the Middle English period or even the Old English period. So it would be quite wrong, of course, for a computer to date my email to the parts of my email to the Old English period, because the text has its own date of composition that's separate from the date of the language in it. That was my first
Sorry,
question.
did you say that you were coding Old English in it?
No, but if I use a word like hand or leg,
Okay, yeah.
or these are words that are unchanged in form since the Middle English period, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, in your training, it's going to ignore those because they're not dateable. It's going to look for the things that are distinctive along the different periods.
Okay. So it's just looking for diagnostic features. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a very straightforward answer. Then the other question, if I may, is I wonder, would you comment on how you might see this developing in terms of its applicability? So would it be the case that this might be used as a sort of hybrid method where people are still following traditional philological methods for dating texts, but they're making use of tools like this in a complementary way or as an alternative, or how would this be used in practice once it matures?
Yeah, I think it has to mature a lot for us to go any further. So, for example, the kind of things that I raised at the end in terms of improving the training corpus to some extent, if a really good thing would be to improve the interpretability, to know why. That's the thing, you can't argue with it. It produces a result, and you have to say, well, do I believe it or do I not? But you can't argue with it. A scholar who comes up with a date has to present an argument. I mean, quite frequently we're very guilty of not, which is say, oh, that's an 8th century text, and no argument is required. You have my authority for that. It's a little bit like that. So that's the problem. Getting to a stage where we can introduce some kind of transparency to it, but failing that, I think, I mean, there are interesting possibilities when it's working with level of accuracy. So, for example, even just being able to say, well, a text is Old Irish is quite a useful diagnostic. You know, for many, many texts, if you think of the number of texts we have, none of which have ever been dated, if we could take that and say, well, the machine says it's Old Irish, or the machine says early modern Irish, that in itself is useful. I mean, there are different things that you can do as well. And we've done experiments with this that I haven't talked about. For example, you take a single text that you know is composite, and you look across, because we're dating chunks, we date each individual chunk, which is just a sentence or a couple of sentences, and then look across the entire text and see, well, is part of this text older than another part of it? And in some cases, we can actually do that. And we can color code the text according to the date within it. So there's that kind of, it's kind of like a relative dating. Achieving an absolute dating maybe is a problem, which hopefully a better training corpus could address. There is one important issue that you raised at the start there, Patrick, and that is it linguistic dating? And well, we did think it was linguistic dating until we really got to the end. And then we started to call it temporal analysis, because it may not be analyzing, we don't really know what it's analyzing. It may not be analyzing a language change, but it's picking up on temporal differences between different annals and then building its model around that. So to say, yeah, I may have dropped in linguistic model or something in the middle of all that through habit, but yeah, it's not really a linguistic model as we would understand it.
Thanks very much, Greg. That's very helpful.
Okay, thanks. Doris, you had some questions as well, or?
Oh, I was trying to give Tarek an opportunity to talk there earlier on. No, I don't. Well, maybe I have a question on the. I didn't really get the focusing, the method focusing on that F1 and F2 and F3. I might have missed how you did that.
Yeah. So the basic principle is that we're using this 100-year window to date text, because really we allowed it in that because if you talk to anybody who's doing linguistic dating, and that's the only guide that they have, you know, sometimes people will go and say it's the first quarter or the first third of the 12th century, and you're just going, you can't possibly tell to within a generation when this text was written. I think it's David Shifter quite often cites the old man who's 80 years of age writing alongside somebody who's 20 or 30. Is the language the same, and how could you tell the date of writing of an old man and distinguish that from a younger man working alongside him? So so that 100-year period seemed reasonable, but then to narrow the results down within that. So it doesn't matter whether that's right or wrong. I suppose we're assuming, let's assume that it's right, that it's got the right 100-year period. We want to know, is that early in that century? Is it late in that century? Is it the middle of that century? So that's the idea of focusing. So then within our 100-year window, we have a smaller 20-year window, and we slide that along essentially just to see where the best fit is. And the interesting thing about that is not only does it actually produce results, but you get this grouping starting to happen. So what was previously assigned to two different periods within a 100-year period is now coalescing to an agreed date. So it's it seems to be improving the accuracy, the robustness of the method, as well as just being more precise. Does that explain what we're trying to do?
Yeah,
we're just running exactly the same thing, but instead of using a model at 100 years, we're using a model at plus or minus 10 years, but restricted to that 100-year period that it's produced the first. We could also, I mean, and we did contemplate this, we could say, okay, this text has been dated to the 12th century. So when in the 12th century was it written? We could do that. We could predetermine the 100-year period, or we could predetermine a 200-year period. We just don't think that would be very convincing to anybody, because we cannot argue with that, and we cannot date at that level of accuracy really ourselves either. So you couldn't. There's no way to argue against the machine in that case. So it can't really have any validity.
Okay, thanks.
So I have one question myself. You sort of partially answered it already, but maybe I'll try and ask it anyway, which is to do with, you know, is this dating, or can you distinguish between whether it's dating based on the terminological aspect? So you mentioned name seems to be something it's picking up on, against the linguistic features. And, you know, is there some way that you looked into where you could see if it was more names or if it was more language that it was actually using in the dating process?
I mean, this is all very difficult to. We're looking into a black box here, so we're putting data in and we're getting results out, and so it's interpreting what it's doing along the way has been the issue with it. The reason that I mentioned names is because just out of interest, we ran the English language annals through the algorithm as well, and we're very surprised to find it worked. That's what I say. We thought we were doing this linguistic dating, and then you find, well, hold on a minute. It's working with, and not as accurately, and perhaps that's the encouraging bit. If it's about, I can't remember exactly, it's 40–50% accurate. It's picking up on something within those English language annals. What can it be picking up on? Well, it could be certain terms that are used, but most likely it's the names of particular kings, lords during that period that it is picking up on. So, but when we're actually doing our for everything that I demonstrated here, we're actually using just character n-grams. There's no names, there's no words. Okay, it's just really trigrams are being used. That's the primary thing that's been used within it. So it must be something at either the orthographical level or other things that can be encoded, perhaps linguistic changes or even names. It could be possible that it builds up a propensity for a certain name to occur. Of course, if it is names, then it's not transferable. And one thing that I thought of doing for the early modern period, where we get this high degree of accuracy when we did the annals, but low degree of accuracy whenever we apply that to text, is go back to the annals and train it after stripping out all the names. So it can't learn on the names. It has to learn on other temporal characteristics, and then running it on early modern text to see as well. I hope that explains.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I could certainly, like, I'm imagining, you know, trying to date, you know, English in the 2020s, and, you know, certain words like Brexit and COVID and Trump might occur a lot, and they have very distinctive character freegrams, and you would hope that in 20 years' time we won't be talking about those words anymore as much.
Yeah, but I think that's the key thing, and that's maybe why it is reasonably transferable. It's because it's not learning words. I mean, to learn words would be quite complicated because of the variation in spelling, but also because of inflection. huge degree of inflection in the Irish language. Picking up words in this unsupervised kind of way would have been very difficult for it. But it is possible that they're in there somewhere.
Okay, I think we actually have a bit of a follow-on question from Oksana in the chat. I don't know if you want to ask yourself or.
Which feature importance is Oksana there? Which features in particular?
Yeah, well, I meant that since you're training on a text corpus, each character engram is a feature, right?
Yeah.
And your classifier is using it to make a prediction. So, well, in most libraries, there is, especially if you write it yourself, there is a chance to have a look at how important each feature is in making a decision for the classifier.
Yeah.
And they're basically just scores, but it might give some insights, even though you're working on character level. For example, if you see that like some engrams look like grammatical endings, or I don't know. It might not only be connected to orthography. So yeah, it might not say anything as well.
It's not. I mean, we did generate a big Excel table of features with the probability sorted according to the time period in which they were tested in the training data, and that gives you a big long list. But ultimately, what it does, I mean, it'll give you things like B. So there's a B, it occurs with such and such a probability in the period 950 to 1000, let's say. Okay, as a linguist, that doesn't really tell me an awful lot. What does tell you a little bit more is those kind of things I mentioned earlier. I think like EA, which we would think as a late orthographical variation. Maybe something IGH might be the kind of ending that you're talking about, the grammatical ending. But in early Irish, that's an orthographical variation as well, really. I couldn't really see beyond the purely orthographical very much of what was significant in making these decisions.
Yeah, okay.
It's very difficult to see grammar.
Yeah.
When your window of looking at it is 3 letters, you can't really see the grammar working.
Yeah, that's true. Well, then a follow-up question. Did you try to experiment with longer engrams?
Yeah, I think we did initially. I don't think it lasted terribly long because you've decreased efficiency. And I say Shu was very much focused on efficiency. So we can throw all of these things in, but if it doesn't increase the accuracy significantly, then we just jettisoned it. So by the time we got down to trigrams, that's about the limit of what was useful.
Yeah, fair. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Oksana.
Okay, thank you. Do you have another question from Park, or is that just more of a comment?
I was just reflecting on all the different factors that influence the output. It's very, very interesting to consider. I wonder, is stylistics a category that you've thought about? I'm sure you've thought about the issues, but just collocation of words and phrases and the other markers of stylistics. The early annals tend to be very blunt and short, and then it gets more elaborate. And would style be a category that influences the results? I mean,
almost to some extent, you're getting to the level of grammar, and then above that again. So conceptually higher than that again. It quite possibly does. What you're talking about in terms of the length of sentences, for example, could well be an issue. It could well be one of the things that has been picked up on. I suppose the slightly surprising thing, and well, it might not be surprising, is to sit down and do a stylistic comparison between, say, 12th century annals and 12th century prose texts. One of the things that really surprised us was that it actually dated Sultan Iran, the verse text, properly. It actually dated that very accurately. And we didn't really expect it to work on a verse text. And of course, many of the texts that we're dealing with are prosometrical. So they have the mixture of prose and verse within them. So yeah, it could well be another influencing thing, but it's difficult to assess. As I say, it's very difficult to actually know exactly what it's working on.
I wonder what would have happened if you left the Latin in, because
yeah, well, I mean, we did actually think about doing that, because you want to do the least amount of damage as possible to the training text, and taking them out actually it affects this is another aspect. It affects the structure of sentences. If you just peel out the Latin, then you've got part sentences now. You don't really have whole sentences anymore. But I'm pretty sure it would have worked very well for the annals. It would have increased the accuracy of the annals model, and it would have probably dated a lot of the earlier material quite accurately. It might well have been using topic modeling, so it would have been using things like names or particular words associated with different time periods. The trouble is we were trying to get it to the next stage. I was thinking, well, we want to use this to date text of unknown date. And in that case, it might well have, I'm pretty sure, let's say you had a text which had lots of Latin in it, it probably would have just dated it to Old Irish period, regardless of when the text was written itself. So it was on that basis that we just stripped out the Latin. Not any disrespect for Latin, but
don't worry, Greg. I mean, it might have trained it for a text that involved lots of code switching, but then it's not very well trained for texts that are Irish only.
Yeah.
Okay, great. There's no more urgent questions. I think that's probably a good place to leave it. So I'd just like to say go with Margaret, Harish. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. So our next seminar series will take place again at the end of the month. We're welcoming Niels Reimers from Hugging Face, who's going to be talking about neural search in the low resource scenario. And this will take place exceptionally on the Tuesday because it's a bank holiday here in Galway on that Monday. So it'll be Tuesday at 5 o'clock Irish time. And I've just put a link to the event right into the chat. So you're all very welcome. I look forward to seeing you all next month. I'll say is thank you again to Greg, and thank you to everyone for coming. And well, yeah, see you in a month.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay. Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.